Hey everyone, my name is Alvin and welcome to my channel. This is the second part of my Phalaenopsis Orchid Care series where I will be talking about repotting an orchid. If you are interested in purchasing an orchid, I invite you to check out the first part of the series up here where I will give you tips on how to purchase an orchid. Also, I'll be covering a few different topics in regards to repotting in this video and try to provide my experiences as well as information and my reasonings behind those topics to help you understand why I'm doing what I'm doing. So with that said, with all the information that I will be sharing with you, it may make for a longer video. So I invite you to take a look at the description box below and check out the timestamp section. I'll have a list of the topics I'll be covering and you can click on those timestamps to skip ahead to a different section if you'd like. Orchids are epiphytes, which means that they grow on something. In nature, this would usually be the side of a tree, where its roots are growing into the grooves and crevices of the tree trunk. So this tells us that orchids prefer a fast-drying, airy medium. Most orchids are sold potted in sphagnum moss, and this is because sphagnum moss holds a ton of water, so it keeps the plant hydrated from its travels from the grower to the stores, and then ultimately to you and I, the consumer. Sphagnum moss itself is a great growing medium for some plants, but the issue with it in retail orchids is that in order to prevent the orchids from shifting and falling out during transport, most growers usually will pack that sphagnum moss pretty tightly into the pot. So with it being so compacted, it isn't able to get adequate airflow, and sometimes it stays wet too long and it will have a higher chance of causing root rot to the orchid. With that said, if you just purchased an orchid and it came potted in sphagnum moss, but it's also currently in bloom, you won't want to repot that orchid right away. The best time to do so would be after it's done blooming. And the reason for that is because orchids can suffer from what's called bud blast or bloom blast, depending on the stage of flowering. Bud blast basically means that the buds on your flower stalk will fall off before it actually opens. Whereas bloom blast means that your plant is already in bloom and those blooms will fall off prematurely. So for example, if we were to repot our orchid here that's in bloom and we end up finding a bunch of roots that are rotting and we end up cutting those off, it could signal to the plant that, hey, I'm losing roots and I need to grow new roots. So then in that case, it's going to abort its flowers and redirect that energy down to the main plant to focus on growing new roots. The other times that we would usually need to repot our orchid would be if our plant needed a bigger pot or if we needed to refresh its medium. Remember, bark is an organic matter and it breaks down over time, and as a result, it could become compacted. If it's too compacted, then it will obstruct the flow of water and airflow. Let's talk about the things that we'll need to repot our orchid. There are different ways that orchids can be grown, but for this video, I'm going to talk about growing them in a pot. So obviously, we are going to need a pot. So most orchid growers and avid collectors will grow their orchids in a plastic pot like this that have holes or slits in them. These clear plastic pots serve two main purposes. The first one is that it allows us to assess the health of the roots and allows us to visually see when we should be watering our plants. Some people also say that because there's some green in the roots, that the roots itself are able to photosynthesize. So a clear pot will allow the roots to absorb some of that light. I don't know how much truth is in that theory, but just be aware that most of the photosynthesis will happen in the leaves, so do not worry about trying to get light to the roots. The second functionality of these pots are the holes or the slits in them. These allow for better drainage and airflow. Remember, orchids go through a dry and wet cycle, so we want to try and imitate that in our home. So it's important that our medium dries out quickly and doesn't stay too wet. So with all that said, do you need to grow them in a clear plastic pot? The answer is no. If you are confident in your watering schedule and your care of these plants, then you can pretty much grow them in any pot that you like. I personally prefer to grow mine in a plastic pot like this, and then I simply just set it inside a decorative pot. So these plastic pots are usually referred to as orchid pots, and they come in a variety of sizes. And usually you can find them at your local greenhouse or plant store. And if you cannot find them locally, you can always order these online. Alternatively, you can make your own pots, which is what I prefer to do. All you need is a clear plastic container, and then just make sure that you thoroughly clean it, and then grab a drill and drill some holes in them, or else grab a soldering iron and poke some holes in them. There is no right or wrong way to do it. You just have to make sure that you get holes all over the pot, from the top, middle, bottom, and also the underside of the pot. I kind of lined mine up when I did mine, just because I'm a little bit of a perfectionist that way, but honestly, I set mine in a decorative pot anyway, so no one's going to tell but me. The only other thing that I'll mention is that you want to make sure that your holes aren't too big that the bark and whatever else you put inside your pot doesn't fall out. The next important thing that we'll need is our potting medium. So there are different opinions as to what should go into your mix, but ultimately that depends on you and your climate. If your mix is drying out a little too quick, then you may have to amend it to stay wet a little longer. Conversely, if it is staying wet for too long, you would have to amend it to dry out a little quicker. Remember, we are trying to imitate the orchid's natural habitat where water is not always readily available to it, so it does go through a dry and wet cycle. So for me, I have a watering schedule of about once a week, so I prefer to have my orchids stay wet for 4 to 5 days and then have a 3 to 2 day dry period. I prefer to make my own orchid potting mix, that way I can control how fast or slow it dries out. But there's nothing wrong with buying a prepackaged orchid mix. Just be aware that most of that will be orchid bark, and depending on the quality and what kind of tree bark it is, it could stay wet longer or dry out quicker. And you just have to monitor that and adjust your watering schedule accordingly. There are three main ingredients that I use in my orchid mix, and that is orchid bark, leca balls, and sphagnum moss. So let's talk about orchid bark first. I'm currently using this Pro Mix Orchid Mix, which is mostly Western fir bark with added charcoal and perlite, which I will touch on afterwards. I find it is a good mix of big and small bark chips, so it gives you that chunky, airy mix. I like using this Pro Mix bark because I find it's a bit better quality, and what I mean by that is that the bark doesn't stay wet for too long, and I find it doesn't degrade as fast as some of the other orchid bark brands that I've used in the past, which also means that I don't have to repot my orchid as frequently. The next media that I like using is LECA. If you're not familiar with LECA, it's an acronym for Lightweight Expanded Clay Aggregate, which is basically a fancy way to say puff clay balls. So leca is processed from clay, so it is an inorganic material, so it won't break down like our bark will. I like to use leca in my mix to help build that airy, chunky mix that we're looking for by adding in some big air pockets. So those air pockets will allow better airflow and water drainage and help our potting mix dry out a little quicker. So with all that said, if my potting mix is staying wet for too long, I'll add a little bit more leca balls in to help dry it out faster. The third media that I like to use in my mix is sphagnum moss. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, sphagnum moss holds a ton of water, so I use it to help distribute water throughout the container, as well as to help keep the potting mix moist a little bit longer. So if my mix is drying out a little too quick, I'll add a little bit more moss into it to keep it wet longer. There are two other medias that I often see people recommending to add to the orchid mix, and that would be the charcoal and perlite that I mentioned earlier that's in my Pro Mix formula. So with charcoal, the benefit of adding that in is that it helps combat bacteria and absorbs odors as the organic matter, such as our bark and our moss, decays. But I don't think it's absolutely necessary to have it in your mix, as long as your media isn't decaying fast enough that it's starting to smell. As for perlite, it serves the same purpose as leca in that it helps create those air pockets. But for me, I personally wish that I didn't have the perlite in my mix, just because I've noticed that the perlite is smaller than the holes in my pot. So I've noticed that a lot of the perlite actually washed out of my pot. So I don't think it's absolutely necessary that you have perlite, but it would be advantageous to add a bit of leca in if you can. So those are the products that I use in my potting mix. I don't have a specific bark to leca to moss ratio that I follow. I usually go by trial and error. I usually start with a 70% bark to 20% leca to 10% moss ratio, and then I adjust it from there. You'll just have to figure out what works in your climate and growing space, and then adjust your potting mix by adding either a little bit more leca or moss. I find that here in Saskatchewan, with our dry prairie climate, that my bark tends to dry out a little bit quicker, especially my smaller pots like this tend to dry out a little bit quicker than my big ones, like this one here. So I tend to amend my smaller orchids with a bit more moss to keep it wet a little bit longer. So let's get to the process of repotting an orchid. I will be repotting this one here today. I currently have it in this small plastic container. This is the same container that it came in when I bought it from the store. It came potted in sphagnum moss, and then I had repotted it in a orchid mix. So we have to remember that orchids grow epiphytically in the wild, so their roots would be growing into the grooves and crevices of the tree trunk. So orchids don't mind being in a small space. So that is why I still have it in the small container. But as you can see, it's actually popping out of the container now. I have some roots at the bottom that are coming out of the slits. And I find that this media is drying out a lot quicker than I would want it to. So it's time for me to pot this one into a bigger pot. Alright, so things might get a little bit messy with our repotting, so I've set down some paper on my work surface to help with the cleanup. So first thing that you're going to want to do is remove your plant from the pot and remove the medium that it's growing in. So my orchid is currently in orchid bark, so I'm just going to pull mine out and try to get as much of that media out as possible. Also, you can see here there's some roots growing out of the slits in the holes, like that. So I want to try and wiggle those roots out and try not to break them, but because there's just a little bit of them poking out, I don't think I'm going to be too worried about breaking them. So if you have yours potted in moss, just make sure that your moss is fairly moist. It's easier to break apart wet moss than dry moss, so just give it a soak for a few minutes and that should help make it easier. So alternatively, you can cut the pot to free the roots if you want, but I want to try and save the pot for another plant, so I want to try to avoid cutting this pot. I'm actually going to just break off this root here because it's not going to fit through, I don't think. There we go. So now I've got it out of the pot, and I just want to remove as much of this medium as I can. Alright, so I got most of the orchid bark out of the root system now. There are some leca balls and some bark stuck in here. It just seems like they're a little bit too stuck to the roots, so I don't want to disturb them too much. So I'm just going to leave them. You can also take this now to the sink and just give it a rinse if you'd like to get it a little bit cleaner. But mine don't seem that dirty, so I'm going to leave mine as is. Before I put this into its new pot, it's a good opportunity for us to check our roots. We want to make sure that they look nice and healthy and remove any dead or dying roots. So to tell if it's nice and healthy, they're going to be either the silvery or green color and they feel pretty plump. If you have any brown and papery roots like this, that's a good indication that they are dead. So in this case, we would want to cut these off. So I have a pair of scissors here, so I am just going to go ahead and remove these dead roots. If you have some brown looking roots like this one here, for example, you want to make sure that you give them a feel before cutting them, because sometimes it might just be fertilizer burn or the tannins from the bark. If the root still feels plump, then leave it. But if it's a bit mushy or papery, then you can go ahead and cut it off. Alright, so our root system is now cleaned up, and I've gotten rid of the old potting mix and replaced it with some fresh potting mix. And as you can see, it's pretty nice and chunky, which is what our orchid is going to like. So I'm going to put it into this pot here. So as you can see, it's a bit bigger than its original pot, but it's not too big for it either. So I want to start by adding some orchid bark mix into the bottom of that pot, and then placing this inside, and then I'm just going to fill it up with our mix here, like this. So you also want to give it a shake or tap onto your workspace just to get that potting mix settled into the pot and around the roots. Also, if you're not familiar with orchid roots, orchids have two types of roots. Roots that are inside the media here, and then you're going to have orchid roots like this that grow outside of the pot, and these are referred to as aerial roots. So I don't know if you guys noticed before when I was unpotting it, but this root here was actually outside of the pot. So I am actually going to leave this one outside, and I'm not going to pot it inside the pot. So these roots are adapted to living outside the media. So when you're repotting, it's not necessary to stick these aerial roots into the potting mix. These aerial roots are actually another method for the orchid to collect water. So if we think about orchids growing on a tree in nature, there's only so much surface area for the orchid to spread its roots. So by growing these aerial roots, it allows the orchid to get water from the humidity in the air, or even reach out in another direction to collect water when it rains. Alright, so that should do it. As you can see, I filled this pot as best as I can with the potting mix. Next, I'm just going to run this under the tap just to help settle down the potting mix and also rinse off any small particulates that may be present in the potting mix. I'll also want to check that there is adequate air pockets in there. And also when I'm running it under the water, I just want to make sure that the water is draining fairly quickly. So at this point, if the potting mix ended up settling down and there's some room at the top, I can just top it back up with some more potting mix. So that concludes our video on repotting. Please give this video a thumbs up if you found it helpful. Again, if you haven't watched the first part of this series where I give you tips on how to purchase an orchid, I invite you to do so. In the next part of this Phalaenopsis Orchid Care series, I will be talking about watering and fertilizing an orchid. So please consider subscribing and hitting the notification button down below to be notified when it's out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.